Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovitt, and I'm so glad that you're here joining us. You know, I hope you've taken the time to read the lesson, and now you're going to listen to this video, and then you can go ahead and enjoy the discussion questions, whether you're by yourself or you're with a group. You can kind of go through the questions, meditate on the passages, reflect on them and think. That's the best way to do this, is to get into the program first. So when you get it through email, you can go ahead and just read the lesson and then watch this presentation and then discuss the questions. Today we're on session 5, the brain, soul, and spirit, our deep desires. Now, we've been studying the brain and we'll continue, but it's important to see the integration of the brain. The brain is part of our physical part of the body, right? And is a very important part as we've been studying. But there's those non-material parts of us as well. And that's soulishness, which is our mind, our emotions, and our will. And then we have the spirit, and that's spirit that connects with God when we're born again. All those things are integral into who we are and who we become. And today we want to just kind of touch on that. It's like a car. You don't have to know everything about a car in order to drive it. I mean, it helps if you know some things, right? I mean, I remember renting a car once, and I put in to get some gas, and I didn't know how to open a gas tank. It was, new car to me, and they had some lever somewhere, and I had to call the rental place to find out how to do that, because without gas, I wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And so sometimes we need to know the basics, and it's like that here. We're not trying to become neuroscientists. We're not trying to learn every part of the brain and the nervous system, but we want to know the basics. We want to know because it's important. If we can name it, we can tame it. Well, what do I mean by that? If we can name our emotions, if we can name some of the processes that are going on, if we can name some of the thoughts that we're having, we can tame it. But a lot of times this stuff's just oblivious to us. When I was in my worst anxiety back in my 20s and 30s, I didn't know what to do. Back then we called it the subconscious mind. And what do you do with that? I remember praying, Lord, help me with my subconscious mind. And then, of course, being a pastor and a minister and that, there was the demonic, and boy, that scared you. What in the world? Well, what do you do there? Of course, I studied Neil Anderson and others and learned how to put on the armor of God and that. But when it came to this subconscious mind and all this ethereal things, what do you do? And then later, decades later, they start coming out with the decade of the brain and learning all these things about neuroscience. And the combination of all that has made just an exciting day for us to know how to change our behavior. And see, part of what we want to do is learn to recognize our emotions. And once we recognize them, we can start to regulate them. And once we're regulating, we're bringing that amygdala and that communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, right? With the rational part of the brain, so we can start to what? Emotionally relearn. It's these things that we believe emotionally that hurt us, right? A person that thinks they're ugly and yet they're not, that's emotionally learned. That's not a cognitive thing, because you can tell them, you're not ugly, and yet will they believe you? No, somewhere they have to emotionally learn the truth. That aha that changes them. And so that's what we're trying to do. And today we're looking at that soulishness part of us and how it integrates with the brain. When we're born as a child, we're one of the most helpless creatures on the face of the earth, The human baby is one of the most vulnerable. We are dependent on our caregivers. They're the ones that are supposed to feed us, protect us, provide for us. They communicate to us that we're special, adored, that we're precious in their eyes, and we're supposed to be safe with them. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. And I thought one day, what would be a letter if God was to write to a new parent a letter about the child? What would he write? And I just wrote something, and you can see it in your notes. And it's, Dear Parent, You are receiving a very special and precious package. It's a soul that I have personally created This baby is significant, and I honor them as my own child with great intrinsic worth. They are an object of my love. Therefore, note that they are lovable and need to be treated that way. They are coming to you in a vulnerable state and need to know that they are always safe and will be comforted when distraught. You must honor them for the human being they are and the fact that I have made them in my image. They are significant and should be esteemed as such. Please give them all the unconditional love you can so they will know and feel how lovable they are. Help them mature, knowing they have a purpose and are free to grow, learn, and mature without fear and live to their fullest potential. Teach them that I am their creator, that I adore them and will never leave them or forsake them. Please let them know how glad I was to have brought them into this world. I desire that they grow into adults loving others in the same way that I love them. Congratulations on receiving this special gift, God. You know, right from the womb, you were meant to belong, be significant, be safe, be comforted. It was intended that you grow up knowing that you're significant and to be filled with a purpose in this life. But for many of us, that hasn't happened. And so we're here now. And what can we do? We can apply the things that we're learning in this class and learn to be resilient. We can learn to overcome these. We can change our mind and we can change our brain, and we can start reconfiguring new pathways so the triggers are gone and we have new ways of thinking. So when we think of that, what are some of our soulish needs? What are some of our needs? Well, we need to know that we matter and belong. We need to be known as lovable and that you have worth. That was one that I was really stuck on. We need to be safe and comforted. I walked around hypervigilant trying to please people. I didn't feel safe. And we need to know that we're significant and have honor and to have a purpose. And when you turn to page 2, you'll see an exercise there, and I encourage you to do this. I'll just go through it lightly here, but I've taken those 5 things, that those soul yearnings, and I've asked you 3 different ways to look at them 3 different ways. First of all, cognitively, do you believe the statements that you matter or belong, or that you're lovable and have worth, that you feel safe and comforted, and that you're significant, and that you have a purpose? And then I asked it, I twisted it up, do you feel these statements are true? You know, it's one thing to say, yeah, I believe I'm smart. Or I could ask you, have you ever, are you stupid? And you'd go, well, no. But then I could ask you, have you ever felt or been made to feel stupid? And you might think back and when you were young and someone ridiculed you, you were trying to write something on a board and you put the wrong answer down and everyone in the class laughed at you and you were humiliated. And at that point, you said to yourself, I'm never going to do this again. Why? Because I'm stupid. Well, you're not stupid, but that was an emotional learning. And it's those things. And so later in life, we're called to come up in front of someone to do something. Does our cognitive process turn on and say, I'm smart, I can do this? No. All of a sudden, that emotional learning that we had says, uh-oh, danger, don't do it. You might be humiliated. And those are the things that we need to change. And that's why it's important to ask, have I ever felt? Do I feel these are true? Maybe you don't. And that's okay, because we can change. And then I added a third, because remember we had 3 ways of learning last time. We learned emotionally, we learned socially, and then we also learned rationally, right? And this is the one that covers that socially. How do you feel when you're with other people? When you're in a crowd, maybe it's a crowd of people you do know. Maybe it's a crowd of your contemporaries, Maybe it's people you don't know. How do you feel then? And I think you'll get some clues here of what you're starting to believe about yourself. And you can share with your group later about how you felt there, okay? Many of our negative habits come from shame, anxiety, and desire. They come from the lack of believing these things about ourselves. And that means that when we don't know and understand these truths in our very being, then we seek substitutes or react to protect ourselves. And once we start to see and believe and act with this negative mindset, it creates a neuronal pathway. And this pathway, if not stopped, will self-perpetuate these negative beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. And that's that think, act, and feel loop. And it goes around. And, if I'm unlovable, for example, I will become afraid to put myself in a place where I'll be seen as inadequate. I fear being exposed or humiliated. And if pain from not belonging is too great, I feel helpless and depression can set in. I can easily become anxious as well. Do you see how that works? And we have to ask ourselves, when I'm feeling emotional, where's it coming from? Is it coming from negative beliefs about ourselves? And that's the kind of thing that we want to change, because you see, we have a negative bias. We're going to look out for those things that we think are going to humiliate us, or that are going to hurt us or harm us or cause someone to think negative about us. We're going to look for those things. We're wired for self-protection. It means that we're more conscious of negative things that could hurt us than positive things around us. And this is key. Not only do we have a negative bias, we have a default mode, right? We have a default mode. When we start to feel negative, we start going into this, this thinking, this rumination, this negative thinking. It's almost like a dissociation or a fixation, right? It's all of a sudden we're in autopilot, and what? We start thinking with, this awareness of ourself. And we get introspective, and we start to think negative things about ourselves, this rumination. And we notice this a lot of times when we shut down. All of a sudden we start asking, what's wrong with me? What are others thinking or going to think about me? What's wrong with other people? We start this negative rumination. That's why I've written a piece that you can get at our website, ronovit.com. I have a course on, what do we do with downtime temptations, right? This kind of stuff starts happening. And then what happens? Shame comes in, other painful emotions, and it activates, this part of our brain that says, I want to escape. I don't know what to do with this. I got to comfort myself. And see, if we don't have the intrinsic ability to know the truth and comfort ourselves, if we don't have the emotional resilience, right, then we're going to seek it other places. We're going to seek it other places. And so that's why I ask ourselves a lot of times when we're starting to feel, when we recognize that we want to escape, because this works with cravings as well. When we're starting to think negative, we start to recognize it, we can ask ourselves, what am I feeling? What am I believing right now? What am I believing about me? What's the truth? That's important, and it's in there on page 4, and I would circle that, and I would really put that up somewhere where I can start to ask those questions. If not, then we tend to escape, and I have an acronym here for escape: excitement, substance, comfort and behavior, avoidance, and dissociate, people, emotionalism, sex, different things that we can seek to fulfill that negative feeling that we have, to comfort us, to get us out of that funk, if you will, to numb us out, to do whatever. But you know what? It doesn't solve the problem. And that's why, even though we'll recognize our emotions and we start to regulate it, if that's all we've done, then all we're doing is coping. The goal of this program is to help us start to emotionally relearn so we're not triggered in the first place. And a lot of times this negative desire, these wanting to escape, they substitute for this felt inadequacy. And that's a key word. And what do I mean by that? I said felt inadequacy. That's because a lot of times these things are felt beliefs. We get triggered, and when I start feeling negative, I feel this thing going on in my body, and I start spiraling right away. And that's part of recognition. We got to recognize when our body is starting to react, because our mind is going to follow it. It's going to follow it. And those negative desires, escapes, they lead to habits. They lead to habits. And what we need to do, it's far better to start learning the positive things about ourselves, how loving and significant we are. Then we can change our desires. And that comes with some of that emotional relearning. And that comes from being reparented, which we'll talk about later in the class. And so we need to be purposeful now in finding out the real truth about ourselves. And that's part of what we're going to do. In the book Biology of Desire, Dr. Lewis says this: personality development is nothing really more than laying down of habits for getting along in the world. Habit of attraction, habits of self-regulation, habits for easing emotional concerns, those are all good things. Habits for avoiding rough edges in our lives. So we can view addiction, because that's that avoidance part, right, as a branch of personality development, growing out of the residue of unmet needs and failed attempts. And so a lot of times when we feel down, it'd be good if we had that habit of what? Recognizing and regulating, but instead sometimes we want to escape, and that becomes a habit. That becomes a habit. And he says, and you can see that on the bottom of 5, drugs, booze, gambling, porn take us out of ourselves. They focus our attention elsewhere. They may rev up our excitement and sense of mastery in the case of speed or coke and gambling or porn. Or they may quell anxiety directly by lowering my amygdala activation in the case of sedatives, opiates, booze, and comfort food. We find something that relieves the gnawing sense of wrongness. We take it and then we do it again. And you may be asking, Ron, why are you covering this? Because I think many of us are using these things to escape. We don't believe we're addicted, and I'm not here to judge anybody. The trouble with our definition of addiction is that it says this, it gives this impression that we're doing it all the time and we can't stop. And so it stops us from realizing how frequently we are getting involved. And so we never change. And I'm mentioning this because some of us may be using this for a crutch. And we're never going to get to the emotional relearning if we're coping, if we're regulating in negative ways. And it only gets worse because we need more and more of it. Another way we do it is putting on a mask. Putting on a mask. And I like what Dr. David Benner talked about in The Gift of Being Yourself. He says, at some point in childhood, we all make the powerful discovery that we can manipulate the truth about ourselves. Initially, it often takes the form of a simple lie, frequently a denial of having done something. But of more importance to the development of the false self is the discovery that our ability to hide isn't limited to what we say or don't say. We learn to pretend. We discover the art of packaging ourselves. Our masks have become our reality, and we have become our lies. In short, we have lost authenticity and adopted an identity based on an illusion. I encourage you to read that over again. Discuss that perhaps in your group, or think about it by yourself. What's that mean? Am I being true to myself? And that's where we can come and talk to God. That's where we can start seeking spiritual truth and allow God to break through our veneer. He can help us with our escapes. He loves you. He can help us know who we truly are. I love the story of the prodigal son. And so often we talk about the love of the Father. And I get that. That's the truth. Jesus, I'm sure, was trying to illustrate the fact that the Father ran to the Son. He was waiting for the Son to come home. And that's a critical part, especially in that day and age, because normally this prodigal son story would be the father would say, "You're no longer my son." But instead, Jesus showed this compassionate Father. But there was another part that was important. Jesus, in that time back then, there was a shame culture going on. And it's prevalent today in many areas of the world where we have this sense of shame. And I think it's very important that Jesus included in the story where the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. Kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and is now returned to life. He was lost, and now he is found." And so the party began. Now what's that say? That says that the father restored the honor of the son. He restored the honor. He said, "Get the robe," which was that, sign of being redeemed and forgiven, cleansed, made right? You're my son again. And he said, "Get the ring," which talked of royalty, right? Sign of affection and wealth and authority. And he said, "Get the sandals," which again was of responsibility and authority. And he restored the son who was lost, the son who rebelled, the son who had all these negative feelings of himself. "Father, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." He took that, he dismissed it, and he restored his honor. And my friends, that's what God wants to do to you and to me. He wants to restore the honor that was robbed from us. Remember the letter from God I read in the beginning? God loves you. He honors you. He gave you intrinsic worth. And somehow, for so many of us, it was robbed. It was taken away or never given by those that should have helped us understand it. And that's immaterial at this point. The point is, are you going to allow God to restore your honor? Are you going to work the things in this program that will help you understand the truth of who you really are? Where you can start to recognize the emotions that are going on. You can regulate them, and then you can emotionally relearn the truth, and you can start living in the fruit of the Spirit, the love and the joy and the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, and the self-control that God has for you today. Let's start the process of restoring our honor.